In 2007, in the small town of Redford, located in Michigan, life went on as usual. With a population of just over 3,000 people, this city was a place where everyone knew each other. On the main street, there were old buildings that had survived more than one generation, and in the center of the city stood St. Paul's Church, where residents gathered every Sunday to discuss the latest news and socialize. Caroline Winters, a 55-year-old widow, has lived in Redford since birth. Her house, ancient and cozy, was located on the outskirts of the city, next to the forest. Caroline has always been a respected member of the community, even after the death of her husband, who died tragically in an accident 5 years ago. She rarely left the city and almost always spent her time at home, gardening and reading. She has a reputation as a woman who knows the secrets of all residents but is never in a hurry to divulge them. The people of Redford lived in the shadow of a past that never fully let go. Stories of incidents, rumors, and secrets that were passed from mouth to mouth created an atmosphere of tension, as if something dark was hovering over the city. And this gloomy feeling intensified when one day in August 2007, a terrible event occurred that shocked the entire city. Logan Miller, a 19-year-old young man, was found dead on the edge of the woods, not far from Caroline's home. His body was discovered by a passerby who was walking his dog. The circumstances of his death were strange and frightening. Logan's body lay in the thick brush, covered with leaves and branches, as if someone had deliberately tried to hide it. There were signs of strangulation on his neck and cuts on his arms, as if he was trying to defend himself. When Sheriff Michael Walker arrived on the scene, he immediately realized that this case would go beyond the scope of a normal investigation. The city of Redford has rarely seen such crimes. Walker was a man of strong character who always tried to maintain order in his city, but this murder was out of the ordinary incidents that he had to deal with. Walker called for help from Detective Jonathan Reeves, whom he knew from their days working together in the Detroit police. Reeves was an experienced investigator capable of solving the most complicated cases. Arriving in Redford, he immediately began his investigation by examining the crime scene and interviewing witnesses. His attention was immediately drawn to the house of Caroline Winters, which was located just a few hundred meters from the place where the body was found. Reeves immediately noted that the city lives its own life, hidden from prying eyes. He felt that behind the friendly smiles of the residents, there were dark secrets that could shed light on Logan's murder. The first thing he decided to do was question those who knew Logan closest, and those who may have seen him in the last hours of his life. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread throughout the city at incredible speed. In cafes, at gas stations, in stores, everywhere they talked only about the death of Logan Miller. Some claimed to have seen him with an unknown woman the night before. Others suspected he was involved in something dangerous. But one thing was clear. Logan's death had everyone in Redford on edge and looking over their shoulders. Caroline, having learned about Logan's death, could not find a place for herself. She had known him since childhood, remembered him as a little boy playing on the street with other children. It seemed incredible to her that someone could deal with him so cruelly. But deep down she felt that this incident would be the beginning of the end of her quiet life in Redford. Detective Reeves gathered all available information and prepared for the next stage of the investigation. He had to find out which of the residents of this seemingly calm town could be involved in the murder. With each new interrogation and each new fact, he became more and more convinced that something dark was hiding in Redford, which everyone knew about, but was silent. Thus began an investigation that would change Redford's life forever. The day after Logan Miller's body was found, the town of Redford was plunged into a state of anxiety and fear. It seemed that the atmosphere itself had become heavier, and the silence, usually so calming, now pressed on the ears as if expecting something terrible. Everyone was talking about Logan's murder, and everyone was trying not only to understand what was happening, but also to protect their family from possible danger. Sheriff Michael Walker, being one of the few people born and raised in Redford, knew every resident very well and was familiar with their habits and behavior. But now he had to look at these people differently, with suspicion. The very thought that one of his neighbors could commit murder made him furious and desperate. Detective Jonathan Reeves, meanwhile, examined the crime scene with professional care. The wooded area where the body was discovered was a complex network of paths leading to different parts of the city. The place was known only to those who had lived in Redford long enough to know all its nooks and crannies. Carefully examining the ground, Reeves noticed signs of a struggle: broken branches, dents in the ground, drops of blood. Everything pointed to the fact that the murder had been committed here in the forest. An examination of Logan's body confirmed initial suspicions. He had been strangled. There were deep marks from a rope or cord on his neck, and numerous bruises and cuts on his arms and face, indicating that he had tried to defend himself. The detective immediately realized that this was not a random murder. This was a deliberate and brutal crime. One of Reeves' first steps was to establish the exact time of death. The medical examiner determined Logan died around midnight, narrowing the suspects to focus on those seen near the crime scene during that time. But in a small town where everyone knows each other, finding suspects was not so easy. Most residents simply did not believe that anyone they knew could do such a thing. The first person Reeves questioned was Caroline Winters. Her house was too close to the crime scene for this to be a mere coincidence. Although Caroline was shocked by the news of Logan's death, the detective noticed something strange in her behavior. She was too calm, almost distant, which could indicate shock or something else, more secretive. Reeves knew he couldn't jump to conclusions right away, so he continued to question her about what she might have seen or heard that night. Caroline claimed that she went to bed early and did not notice anything suspicious. However, her answers were too general, as if she was avoiding discussing something important. The detective also turned his attention to other residents who might know something. Margaret Maggie Winters, Caroline's daughter, arrived in Redford the day after news of Logan's death. She was concerned that her mother might be involved in this matter, but did not dare to openly suspect her. Maggie knew that her mother communicated with Logan, but did not suspect that this communication could end so tragically. Reeves also turned his attention to Bobby Smith, a local resident who was rumored to know Logan. Bobby had problems with the law in the past and often got into fights, making him one of the possible figures capable of such a crime. He lived alone, on the outskirts of the city, and led a secluded lifestyle which made his behavior even more suspicious. While the detective collected facts and built a chain of events, the city continued to live in fear. People avoided the streets in the evenings, closing their doors and windows, hoping that the killer would be found as soon as possible. Reeves knew that he needed to collect all the pieces of this intricate puzzle as quickly as possible in order to restore justice and restore peace to this small but deeply shaken city. Detective Jonathan Reeves threw himself into the investigation, realizing the gravity of the situation. Despite his impressive career, where he had to deal with a wide variety of crimes, this case stood out for its darkness and uncertainty. The small town of Redford, it would seem, was the last place where one would expect such a brutal crime. However, the facts pointed to the opposite, and Reeves had to figure out which of the local residents could decide to kill the young guy. The first days of the investigation proved particularly difficult. The city community was shocked by what happened, and people were in no hurry to open their doors to the police. Despite this, Reeves carefully interviewed everyone who could be in any way connected with Logan Miller. He started with Caroline Winters' immediate neighbors, including those who lived near where the body was found. The old forest that became the scene of the crime was well known to all residents of Redford. It was considered safe, and many children played there, and adults often went on picnics or just for walks. But now the forest had become a symbol of horror, and no one wanted to remember that it had once been one of the favorite places in the city. Reeves decided to start with Caroline Winters. Although she denied any involvement and claimed that she saw nothing suspicious that night, her behavior remained in question. The detective felt that she was hiding something. He invited her to be questioned again at the local police station, hoping for more cooperation on her part. During the interrogation, Reeves kept his eyes on Caroline, carefully analyzing her every movement, every pause between words. She behaved with dignity, but the detective felt that behind this external calm lay a deep internal conflict. Caroline said that she knew Logan since childhood, that he often came to her house and helped with housework, but there was no romantic or intimate relationship between them. Despite her assurances, Reeves could not help but think that something was wrong. Meanwhile, Sheriff Michael Walker continued to interview other city residents. He was not as experienced an investigator as Reeves, but his knowledge of the local people proved a valuable resource. Walker managed to collect a number of rumors and guesses that could shed light on what was happening. He learned that Logan was not such a simple guy as he seemed at first glance. His behavior had recently changed a lot. He often stayed late, avoided old friends, and even began dating people who had a dubious reputation. One of those people was Bobby Smith. Walker recalled how Bobby was caught by the police more than once for fights and petty crimes, but each time he managed to avoid serious punishment. Lately, Smith had been acting particularly strangely. He appeared in town less often, avoided meeting friends, and seemed to be constantly worried about something. Walker decided to take this man under special control and agreed with Reeves to interrogate him in the near future. Meanwhile, Margaret "Maggie" Winters, Caroline's daughter, who came to Redford, also found herself under the scrutiny of detectives. Although her behavior was not particularly suspicious, she was Caroline's only close relative, and Reeves wanted to make sure that she had no ulterior motives. Maggie said that she knew about her mother's connection with Logan, but did not consider it anything unusual. She expressed concern about her mother's condition and the fact that she could become involved in this case, but insisted that her mother could not have committed murder under any circumstances. Reeves continued to collect information, trying not to miss a single detail. He checked Logan's phone records to find out who he had been communicating with in the last days of his life. One of the last calls was a conversation with an unknown number, which was carried out for several minutes a few hours before his death. This number turned out to be registered to Bobby Smith, which only increased suspicions in his direction. The detective decided to search Smith's home, hoping to find any evidence linking him to the murder. The search, carried out with the sanction of the court, yielded results. A rope was found in Bobby's garage that could have been used to strangle Logan. Traces of blood matching the victim's blood were found on the rope. This was the first serious piece of evidence that linked Bobby Smith to the crime. Bobby was immediately detained and taken to the police station. Reeves was ready for questioning, knowing he had strong evidence. But despite this, Bobby was not going to give up easily. He denied any involvement and claimed that he had had the rope for a long time, and the blood on it could have appeared by accident. However, Reeves understood that this was not an accident and decided to put pressure on the suspect in order to get the truth out of him. At the same time, the city continued to live in fear. People were discussing who could be next, because if a killer was on the loose, then no one was safe. However, the arrest of Bobby Smith calmed the residents a little, although many still doubted his guilt. Sheriff Walker and Detective Reeves knew that the case was far from over, and they had to show all the cards to prove the guilt of the suspect, or find the true killer if Bobby turned out to be innocent. Bobby Smith's arrest was a real turning point in the investigation. Residents of Redford began to hope that the case would soon be solved and the perpetrators would receive the punishment they deserved. However, Detective Jonathan Reeves was in no hurry to close the case. He knew that any crime requires careful study of all the details, and although the evidence found pointed to Bobby Smith, much of the story remained unclear. Bobby Smith, despite pressure from the police, stubbornly denied his guilt. He claimed that the rope with the blood was indeed his, but he could not explain how Logan Miller's footprints ended up on it. Bobby insisted that he was home alone on the night of the murder, which, of course, could not be verified. Detective Reeves, listening carefully to his testimony, could not shake the feeling that Smith was either hiding something or was not really the killer. Meanwhile, Sheriff Michael Walker continued to interview Redford residents, trying to gather as much information as possible about Logan Miller and his connections. During these conversations, new details began to emerge that could shed light on the motives for the murder. It turned out that Logan was not the carefree young man that many believed him to be. His behavior has changed a lot in recent months. He became more secretive, often absent in the evenings and acting as if he was hiding something important. Walker found the behavior of Caroline Winters especially suspicious after Bobby Smith's arrest. She stopped leaving the house, avoided communicating with neighbors, and refused to give interviews to local journalists, who, of course, sought to stir up a sensation around this case. Rumors began to circulate in the city that Caroline might be involved in this crime. Some even speculated that she was the one who pushed Bobby to kill, perhaps by blackmailing him or manipulating his feelings. Reeves, having learned about Caroline's behavior, decided to interrogate her again. He understood that without her testimony, the picture of the crime remained incomplete. The detective knew that Caroline and Logan had a relationship that went beyond just friendship. However, despite all the speculation, there was no evidence that their relationship was anything more than just friendship. This time, Caroline's interrogation was more intense. Reeves asked questions, trying to identify any inconsistencies in her stories. Caroline remained calm, but there was tension in her eyes. She still denied any involvement in the murder and insisted that she knew nothing about what happened that night. But the detective noticed that Caroline avoided answering some questions directly, which only increased his suspicions. Meanwhile, forensic experts continued to study the evidence found. A test of the blood on the rope confirmed that it belonged to Logan Miller, making Bobby Smith the prime suspect. However, no other traces were found either on the rope or at the crime scene that could indicate Smith's presence in the forest at the time of the murder. This alarmed Reeves, as the lack of additional evidence suggested that someone could have deliberately framed Bobby. The detective also requested an analysis of Logan's phone records in recent weeks. Examination of the calls revealed several more interesting details. Logan often communicated with a man named George Evans, who had not been mentioned before. George was a new resident of Redford, having moved to town just a year ago. He kept to himself and had little contact with local residents, which made his figure even more suspicious. Reeves decided to interrogate George Evans. Upon meeting him, the detective immediately noticed his nervousness. Evans tried to be polite and open, but his behavior betrayed tension. He claimed that he knew Logan only superficially and communicated with him only on business matters. But when Reeves began asking questions about the night of the murder, Evans became confused in his testimony, which only increased the detective's suspicions. George Evans had no alibi for the night of the murder. He claimed that he was home alone, which made it difficult to verify his claims. Reeves noticed that Evans avoided his gaze when it came to his relationship with Logan. With every minute of interrogation, it became more and more obvious that Evans was hiding something. But what exactly remained a mystery? In parallel with the interrogations, Reeves began to study Logan Miller's past. It turned out that shortly before his death, Logan borrowed a large sum of money from one of the local moneylenders. This detail added a new layer to the investigation, as it became clear that Logan could be involved in some shady dealings, possibly related to illegal activities. Reeves began to build a new version of what happened. Perhaps Logan got involved in something dangerous that ultimately led to his death. But the question remained, was Caroline somehow involved in these events? Could she be the link between Logan and whoever decided to get rid of him? The detective decided to return to analyzing the evidence, hoping to find something that could confirm or refute his guesses. He understood that the investigation was becoming more and more complicated every day, but he was sure that the truth would come out sooner or later. In Redford, meanwhile, panic was growing. Residents began to realize that the killer was still at large, and someone from their environment could be involved in this crime. People tried not to leave their houses after dark, closing windows and doors, trying to protect themselves from an invisible threat. The city, once peaceful and calm, was turning into a place where everyone suspected everyone. Reeves knew he had to act quickly to prevent further escalation of fear and suspicion. He was preparing for a new round of investigation, which could lead him to uncover this complex and intricate story. The investigation continued, and the pressure on Detective Jonathan Reeves became more and more intense. With each new interrogation, with each new discovery, he felt the noose tightening around one of the suspects, but who exactly was the killer remained a mystery. Time passed, and the city of Redford lived in anticipation of the denouement, hoping that the truth was about to be revealed. Reeves carefully studied all the evidence found, trying to put together the scattered pieces of the puzzle. One of the key pieces of evidence found on Bobby Smith almost proved his involvement, but something haunted the detective. There were too many details that didn't add up to the big picture. The rope containing Logan's blood found in Smith's garage looked like framed evidence. It seemed to the detective that someone was deliberately trying to misdirect the investigation. Meanwhile, George Evans, whose behavior during interrogation aroused suspicion, also became the focus of the investigation. Reeves decided to dig deeper and find out more about his past. The detective reached out to his contacts in other cities to obtain a file on Evans. The results were not long in coming. It turned out that George Evans was involved in several criminal schemes before moving to Redford, but he always managed to get away with it. This discovery only strengthened Reeves' suspicions. The detective decided to interview Evans again, but this time based on the information he had received. During the conversation, Reeves began asking questions related to Evans's past, hinting at his previous affairs. Evans was clearly nervous. His answers became less confident, and his attempts to avoid direct answers only increased his suspicions. At one point, Reeves made a move that he hoped would break Evans. He mentioned that he knew of his ties to the underworld and his involvement in other violent cases. Evans, realizing that his past had been revealed, dramatically changed his behavior. He tried to reassure the detective that his past cases had nothing to do with Logan's murder and that he himself was a victim of circumstances. But Reeves felt there was more behind his words than met the eye. While Reeves pressed Evans, Sheriff Walker continued to work on a parallel line of investigation. He took it upon himself to figure out how Logan could be connected to the criminal activity that Reeves had mentioned in passing. Walker discovered that Logan may have been involved in illegal drug transactions. He began to look for connections between Logan and local drug dealers, and his efforts soon bore fruit. It turned out that Logan owed a large sum to one of the small dealers, who, in turn, was associated with George Evans. This new information dramatically changed the course of the investigation. Reeves and Walker began to build a new version of what happened. Logan had become involved in Evans's criminal schemes, and when he could not pay off his debts, he was killed to cover his tracks. But the question remained, how could Caroline Winters be involved in all this? Detective Reeves brought Caroline in for questioning again. He was determined to get answers to questions that still remained unanswered. During the conversation, Reeves directly asked her if she knew about Logan's connections with Evans and his involvement in criminal activities. Caroline clearly did not expect this turn of events, and her reaction showed that she knew more than she had previously said. She admitted that she was aware that Logan could have problems, but did not attach any importance to it, considering him simply young and careless. Caroline said that Logan came to her several times for advice, admitting that he was in trouble, but she did not know how serious it was. Her confession gave detectives new clues as to the motive for the murder, but it remained unclear what role she played in the case. Reeves began to analyze everything he had learned so far. George Evans turned out to be a central figure in this complicated story. He had criminal connections, was involved in illegal transactions, and had a motive to get rid of Logan, who had become a problem for him. But how could Caroline be involved in this story? This time, Reeves decided to take a risky step. He invited Evans and Caroline to a confrontation, hoping that their reactions in each other's presence would provide new clues. During the meeting, Evans was clearly nervous, while Caroline, on the contrary, looked more confident. As Reeves began asking questions, their answers began to contradict each other, and it soon became clear that one of them was lying. At some point, Evans could not stand it and attempted to accuse Caroline of being the one who pushed him to kill Logan, allegedly blackmailing him with her knowledge of his criminal affairs. This announcement stunned everyone, including Reeves. However, Caroline immediately denied these accusations, saying that Evans was trying to shift the blame onto her to save his own skin. Reeves felt he was on the verge of revealing the whole truth, but he needed more evidence. He ordered further analysis of all the evidence, including the rope, to try to find new leads that might shed light on which of them really was the killer. Meanwhile, Sheriff Walker continued his investigations. He found a witness who saw Logan on the night of his murder with an unknown man who closely resembled Evans. This evidence was the last straw that allowed Reeves to draw final conclusions. Reeves gathered all the participants in the investigation and announced that he had found the true killer. All the evidence collected in the case pointed to George Evans being the one who decided to get rid of Logan Miller in order to cover up his criminal deeds. He used his connection to Caroline to gain access to Logan, and then tried to frame Bobby Smith to confuse the investigation. Evans was arrested, and under pressure from evidence, he admitted his guilt. The murder of Logan Miller turned out to be part of a cold and cruel scheme to cover his tracks and cover up his criminal deeds. Reeves was finally able to close the case, returning peace to the city of Redford. With the arrest of George Evans, the city of Redford could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The murder of Logan Miller and the subsequent investigation shocked all residents, but now that the criminal was caught, life in the town began to gradually return to normal. However, the shock of the events and their consequences left a deep imprint in the hearts of people. George Evans was convicted of the murder of Logan Miller, as well as for his participation in a number of other crimes related to drug trafficking and extortion. The trial was speedy because the evidence collected by Detective Reeves was overwhelming. Evans did not deny his guilt, realizing that further resistance was useless. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Caroline Winters, this story was especially difficult. Despite the fact that her direct participation in Logan's murder was not proven, she still felt the condemnation of society. People in Redford began to avoid her, and even those who were once close to her began to be suspicious of her. Rumors and gossip continued to circulate around the city, and Caroline realized that her life here would never be the same. Soon after the end of the trial, she decided to sell the house and move to another city, hoping to start a new life away from the past. Margaret Maggie Winters, Caroline's daughter, was also drawn into this nightmare. She returned to Redford to support her mother, but after all the events, she decided to stay with her only until the passions subsided. Maggie understood that her mother was unlikely to be able to restore her previous position in society, and therefore helped her with the move and settling into a new place. Sheriff Michael Walker, despite the completion of the case, continued to worry that such a terrible crime had occurred in his city. He thought long and hard about how to prevent similar tragedies in the future and how to improve police work to respond more quickly to potential threats. Walker recognized that some red flags may have been missed, giving the perpetrator the opportunity to act. These thoughts haunted him, and he decided to hold a series of meetings with residents to discuss safety measures and improve relations between the police and the community. As for Detective Jonathan Reeves, this case became one of the most difficult in his career, but also one of the most satisfying. Solving the murder of Logan Miller required not only his professionalism, but also his intuition, attention to detail, and the ability to see hidden motives behind the obvious. Despite the successful conclusion of the case, Reeves felt that the incident left a deep mark on him. He understood that life in small towns like Redford could hide many more secrets and dangers than one might expect. Reeves returned to his hometown, realizing that his work in Redford was finished. But the thoughts of how one murder could change the fate of an entire city did not leave him for a long time. He knew that he would remember this case for a long time, and perhaps this particular incident would become a lesson for him in the future. Even in the quietest and calmest places, evil can lurk, ready to manifest itself at any moment. The city of Redford, having survived this difficult period, began to slowly recover. People returned to their daily lives, but the memory of what happened remained in their hearts. The murder of Logan Miller was a reminder to them that the safety and peace in their small town is not as unshakable as it previously seemed. However, life went on, and the residents of Redford did everything they could to make their community more united and ready to face any challenges.